Hello, everybody. Oh my God, three in one day. Wow, you are so lucky. Consider yourselves luck. Anyway, welcome back. This is AP World History with Mr. Incharsky. This is chapter 3 of Unit 4, and we're going to look at colonial societies. In chapter 1, we saw the reasons why the Age of Exploration would happen. We saw state sponsorship. We saw in chapter 2 the initial conquest of Europeans. We talked about Pizarro and Cortez. We talked about the Columbian Exchange. And today we're going to look at this theme of how is the Spanish and Portuguese Empire going to develop? How are we going to see the creation of more formal organization of colonial government? Bell work on the screen, identify and explain one consequence of the Columbian Exchange. I think this was an SAQ one year, so practice right there. All right. So yes, we are going to take a look at a region of North and South America we generally call Latin America. And it's called Latin America because of the, this is generally referring to Spanish and Portuguese settlements. Spain and Portugal, they both speak Latin-based languages, hence the reason why we're called Latin America. All right, so let's take a look at both Spain and Portugal. We're going to first, however, look at the lesson objectives today because we're covering two AP topics. One, I think they're both pretty obvious what we're going to talk about today. All right. So topic 4.4 is going to ask you to explain the process of state building and expansion among empires. So pay attention to how Spain and Portugal design policies to interact with their colonies. And then the topic for 4.7 is going to be this question of explain how social categories, roles, and practices have been maintained or changed over time. And the thing to pay attention to is not only the relationship between Europeans and colonists, but also within racial categories. That's going to be a big theme of this particular chapter, the emergence of racial categories. It's also a big change in world history because in the period between 1450 and 1750, we are seeing the emergence of social categories based on race. In addition to economic class, in addition to religion, we also now have race as a major division and way to socially organize society. But before we do that, let's answer that first topic, actually. And we are going to see that some similarities between all the European states, not just Spain and Portugal, is that many of these European societies follow a historic process we sometimes refer to as the model or stages of colonization. And there are 4 stages of colonization. The first stage is getting there, is setting up a colony. And we call this in historical terms geographic occupancy. Basically, it's the act of conquest. It's the act of claiming territory for the good of the colonizing country. So this is what we were seeing with the conquistadors in Mexico and Peru. These are going to be basically the first entryway to European colonization, is conquest by groups like the conquistadors, groups like, as we will see later on, with not just conquerors with other societies, but also settlers. This is the time when settlers are first coming to the New World. This is also a time period in which we are going to see administration, government speaking, by the initial invaders or settlers. So with the case of the Spanish and the Portuguese, this is when the conquistadors are in charge. This is when they're the governors of these new colonies in the New World. But this is also the time period in where we will see the introduction of European institutions, meaning things like religion, meaning things like gender, meaning things like ideas of class organization. So this is when we are going to see kind of the entryway to different colonial societies. And again, if we're thinking about how do empires develop in this time period, following this 4-step process is generally what they're doing. So you should pay attention to, when we're talking about Spain and Portugal more in detail, how are they following this model? So after you get the settlers there, after you conquer Native American, what's going to happen after that? Well, we are going to see the introduction of ways to organize colonial economies. We see new labor systems. We see new economic systems. And the organization of labor, that's probably kind of the second step of colonization, especially. We will talk about that with regards to the Spanish, to a degree also with the Portuguese. Mostly it's going to go kind of a process like this. First, we see the enslavement of Native Americans. That's largely going to phase out for reasons we'll describe later on in favor of new forms of coerced or forced labor. So we will see the development of something known as the encomienda system. We'll talk about that later. But also eventually we see that transition towards the transatlantic slave trade. That's going to be kind of one of the big new forms of labor that we'll discuss later on today, actually. But after you organize the economy, the labor system of these colonial societies, we are going to see an attempt to organize and consolidate political power. And you do that in a variety of different ways. You do that by introducing cities, by building up colonial capitals. Some big colonial capitals in New Spain, in the Spanish colonies, include places like Havana, Mexico City, Lima. I'm trying to think of anything else. Those are probably the two I can think of off the top of my head. But we do kind of see that this is a time period in which colonial government becomes more centralized, it becomes more formal, but we also see beyond political centralization, we see kind of the consolidation of racial hierarchies. That's going to be something that will develop as a result of colonization. How do we structure society? And how do political systems reflect that? Because we do see the creation of a unique racial hierarchy in the New World, in Spanish and Portuguese colonies. And we'll call this system the castas system. We'll talk about it more later on. Essentially, white people, mixed race people, Native Americans, African Americans, or just Africans, I suppose. So it is going to be a racial system which will clearly have a preference for white people. But finally, you're going to replace these internal colonial administrators, these internal colonial governments with more professionalized bureaucracies. You're going to replace the initial colonial governments that were run by the conquistadors, that were run by the original settlers. And you're going to replace these initial colonial governments with professional government workers, professional bureaucrats from Europe. So we will see kind of this fourth stage of colonization is more direct control by the mother country, by the colonizing country. And we'll see this not just in Spain and Portugal, but to a degree also in France and England, as we will see. So these are the four stages of colonization. They are a historic process by which power is becoming more centralized. So initially, first step, settle, create geographical occupancy, occupy a territory. Step two, make that territory profitable by organizing its economy. What is it going to produce? Organize its labor system. Step three, make sure you have a more centralized colonial government. You build cities, but also you make institutions to ensure stability and control, racial hierarchies. Step four, you're going to see the replacement of the initial colonial governments with more professionalized government workers or bureaucrats. And these are bureaucrats who were directly born in Spain and Portugal, as we'll see later on. So you should be able to identify the four stages of colonization. All right, so that's kind of answering the process generally of how do colonial societies develop over time. And we're going to look now at specific examples. We're going to first look at Spain, and we're going to look at kind of the transition towards more centralized power. We're going to first look at the political changes within Spanish colonies before we look at labor and before we look at racial institutions. All right, so what is going to change as a result of political administration and how that will develop over time? Well, first we got to look at the first step of colonization. Who is going to administer this place once we have the invasion by the Spanish? Well, to provide some context, we first have to look at kind of the labor situation, or excuse me, the class situation in Spain. Well, something that is going to be something that is a bit of a challenge to the Spanish monarchy is how do we reward loyal nobles who are helping us out in centralizing power? Well, initially, the Spanish monarchs, they gave land to loyal nobles during the Reconquista. Once they conquered Spanish Muslim lands, they gave those conquered lands to their loyal noble supporters. But now the Reconquista is over by 1492. Luckily for the Spanish monarchs, luckily for Isabella and Ferdinand, they have a whole new place, a whole new world to give land to their loyal supporters, to the conquistadors that are oftentimes Spanish nobles. So we do see that initially kind of the Spanish conquistadors, these initial invaders and conquerors, they're going to be the colonial governments of the New World, of Spanish colonies in the New World. And they're going to act like nobles. They're basically going to kind of recreate a lot of European institutions in the New World. They're going to introduce a system known as the encomienda system that we'll talk about more in our labor section of this particular chapter. But essentially, it will very much replicate ideas of serfdom back in Europe. And we do see that these conquistadors, they are going to establish their control politically by first enslaving indigenous people. We are going to see that the conquistadors, their government power will largely be through the regulation and conquest of Native American groups. However, we do see kind of a transition towards more political centralization, more direct rule by the Spanish monarchy, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But one of the kind of new religious institutions being introduced into the New World is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church and the conquistadors, they kind of have their own way of ruling over Spanish territory. The Catholic Church is going to establish a series of what we call missions. And these missions essentially are places where we will have a church, but also there oftentimes is some sort of economic activity going on at this mission. Missions operate like cities, basically. And the mission is the establishment of a institution that will seek to convert local Native Americans. And these Catholic missions, they are going to be run by different monastic orders, by the Jesuits, we've talked about them before, but also the Franciscans and Dominicans. I've mentioned them in passing in Unit 1, but they're also going to help out create the mission system and help convert Native Americans to Catholicism. But these missions are going to be very successful. They are going to convert vast amounts of Native American groups into Catholicism. And that's a kind of major reason why Latin America has such a large Catholic population. That's why Catholicism is the largest single denomination of Christianity. I think there are more Protestants in the world, but Catholicism is certainly the largest single group of Christians. For the Catholic Church, in terms of its political power, well, remember the Catholic Church does have a very important place in Spanish society. And while this will change, while we will see more centralization in favor of controlling the Catholic Church, we do see that the Catholic Church in the New World has a lot of political and economic autonomy or independence. Missions can kind of control what goes on with Native American groups under their care. So we do kind of see that initially there isn't a direct Spanish rule over the colonies. It's going to be the initial invaders, the conquistadors, but also these missionaries who create missions that oftentimes oversee Native American populations. They literally live nearby or within the mission. But we do see kind of as a third and fourth step of centralization, we will see kind of these initial colonial governments being replaced with Spanish-born government workers, Spanish-born bureaucrats. We will see consolidation of the Spanish holdings throughout the time period between 1540 and 1713. And we mostly are going to see centralization through the creation of what we call viceroyalties. And a viceroyalty essentially is a territory that is ruled over by a direct representative of the monarchy. So the viceroy is the directly appointed governor, you could say, of a colony. And that viceroy, that direct representative of the Spanish monarchy, they're going to work, they're going to operate as if the Spanish monarchs were within the colonies. And some viceroyalties that will pop up, these are the big territories that Spain will divide up the New World into. They include places like New Spain. New Spain is basically modern-day California all the way to Guatemala, and Peru, which is basically Peru, Bolivia. So we are going to see kind of the creation of more formal organization of government over colonial territory, and they're ruled over by the viceroys. The viceroys are the direct representative of the Spanish monarchy in the New World. And whatever the viceroy says, that is the opinion of the monarch. The monarch has direct messages, direct instructions for the viceroys, and the viceroys make sure those instructions are being followed. So we do see that these new colonial governments, they are going to be agents of the Spanish monarchy. They are going to collect the taxes for the king in the name of the king. They're going to pass laws in the name of the king. So we do see kind of more centralized power that is going to directly represent the interests of the Spanish monarchy. And yes, again, these viceroys, who are they answerable to? Not to officials within the colonies, but to the Spanish monarchy itself. And the Spanish monarchy is going to become a lot more professionalized. There is going to be a bureaucracy that is in charge of administering the colonies, that set out policy as it relates to the colonies. What does Spain want to see happen in the different viceroys? Well, or viceroyalties, I should say. So we are going to see the creation of a professionalized bureaucracy within Spain that will direct how the colonies operate. And this is known as the Council of the Indies. It is an advisory group that the Spanish monarchy will have that essentially is going to set the policy of how the colonies will operate. So something that is very notable in comparison to, say, England, is that countries like Spain and Portugal, and to a degree France, these places, their monarchies will directly control what goes on within the colonies. That's going to be very different from England, as we'll see. So the viceroys, they are the, again, direct representatives of the Spanish monarchs in the New World. And they are in charge of enforcing what the king wants. So this is kind of that third and fourth step of centralization. We are seeing professionalized bureaucrats. We're seeing centralization politically in new cities like Mexico City. That's the center of the new Spanish viceroyalty. Lima for Peru. All right, so we looked at the political centralization. How are we going to organize economically? Well, we're going to organize economically in the big picture through an economic system known as mercantilism. And mercantilism is a major economic system all the European colonial powers will have during the age of colonization, during the age of exploration. And mercantilism in general, it is a protectionist economic theory, economic practice, in which a colonizing country wants to have a favorable balance of trade, where they are exporting more goods than they are importing. And mercantilism involves a lot of different qualifications. It mostly is going to be the economic system of colonization during this time period of 1450 to 1750. And we do see that mercantilism in general, it is this regulation of trade. It's ensuring that the colonies only sell their raw materials to the colonizing country. So any silver, any gold, any lumber, any sugar grown in the colonies can't sell them to another colony, for example. They can't sell them to another European power. They have to only sell them to the colonizing country. So, say New Spain. New Spain can only sell its silver to the Spanish homeland, to the Spanish government back in Spain. We are going to see that mercantilism generally is going to be this system in which colonies are basically set up to provide maximum raw materials for the mother or colonizing country. These colonies are basically organized to make money for the country. It is very much a protectionist system in which we have government control over trade. Colonies will be taxed in order to ensure that the maximum profitability from colonies is ensured. So we do see that this will lead to a discouragement of trade. Middle class people hate this. We'll talk about that later. But it's also going to discourage industry within these colonies. A lot of mercantile policies will explicitly prevent industry because these colonizing countries want to build their own industry, and they want to sell their manufactured goods to a ready and willing market, their colonies. So mercantilism is this economic system in which we will see a strict enforcement of trade between the colonies and the colonizing country. So very much more exporting than importing. It's going to regulate trade, it's going to tax colonists, and it is going to discourage industry within the colonies. So mercantilism will come back to this in relation to the English and the French, but it will describe a general economic system many European colonial societies will engage in. Gosh dang it. All right. So in terms of labor, well, what does the labor system of New Spain and the other Spanish colonies look like? Well, we are going to see the creation of several organizations, several kind of labor systems in the Spanish colonies. And one of them is something I mentioned earlier, the encomienda system. And that is not what I meant to do. But the encomienda system, as we're going to see in a second, is a labor system in which a Spanish noble, a conquistador, for example, is given power over a group of Native Americans. These Native Americans, known as the encomienda, they're going to give their labor to a Spanish noble. In exchange, the Spanish noble promises to protect them and give them Christianity and give them Catholicism. And not only could the conquistadors get this encomienda, could get this exclusive labor rights to a group of Native Americans, but also these Spanish missionaries could. And the encomienda system is going to be the initial way Native Americans are used in labor systems. A big theme in Unit 4 is coerced or forced labor systems. And Native Americans, under the threat of death, basically, are going to be forced into this encomienda system. But it is an extremely brutal system. It will amount to near slavery conditions. Encomienda Native Americans, they are not paid. They are paid merely in protection and conversion to Christianity. That's really it. It's basically enslavement. We do see very brutal treatments towards Native Americans. It is basically enslavement, but the theory is it's not enslavement. So we do see that this is a very cruel system. Native Americans will be tortured. They will be executed if they are resisting this encomienda system. And we do see within the mines, within plantations, that these Native American workers are facing very, very brutal conditions. So the encomienda system is actually going to earn kind of Spain a very bad reputation in the international community. We are going to see a lot of protest, actually, by reformers, by people looking to end this terrible system that amounts to basically slavery. And one such figure is Bartolomé de las Casas. Bartolomé de las Casas, I mentioned him in chapter 2. He's basically the world's first human rights supporter. And he's going to say, this is terrible. We're basically enslaving Native Americans. That's awful. We need to reform this system. We need to end basically this enslavement. We need to end the encomienda system. His solution, unfortunately, is African Americans, or well, Africans, I suppose. But we do see the encomienda system is going to generally kind of die out by the by the 1540s, actually. Although some groups of people, some Spanish nobles, they'll basically ignore this and they'll continue to enslave Native Americans well until the 1700s, well into the 1800s, arguably. It's going to be replaced by a system known as the reparamiento, and essentially this is a wage labor relation where Spanish nobles, Spanish missionaries, they give wages in exchange for labor. So it's supposed to be more fair, but we do see very brutal conditions still continue. But we see other instances of continuity, actually. We do see that the Spanish, in particular in Peru, so in the former Inca Empire, they are going to use the mita system. And remember, the mita system was a conscription, so a draft of workers to work in government projects, to not only build roads, but as the Spanish will use them for silver mines. And the mita system is very brutal as well, because unlike with the Inca, there are no legal rights really for Native Americans. So we do see further basically enslavement, and we do see very brutal conditions. Any man between 16 and 60, they could be drafted to work in these dreaded mines and have terrible labor conditions. But we do see that kind of to replace Native American enslavement, we are going to see the development of African slavery. And we do see that mostly for a few reasons. For one thing, Native Americans are dying out from disease. They're dying out from this brutal encomienda system. So we do see that there is a desire by Europeans to replace them, these Native Americans, with African slaves, with slaves who are resistant to diseases, who are exposed to Afro-Eurasian illnesses. There's also kind of this idea that, Native Americans, they could escape if they wanted to. They know the land. They could blend in with the places that they have lived in for hundreds of years. Whereas Africans, it's a bit harder for that to happen. And we'll talk about African slavery more in our 5th chapter, actually. There's this great video. I would watch it. It's by NBC Learning about the encomienda system. I will link it in Teams if you ask me to. I don't remember some things. Anyway, what is the economic system of New Spain, of the Spanish colonies? Well, it's really going to be divided into 2 areas, agriculture and mining. In terms of agriculture, the biggest thing the Spanish will produce is going to be sugar. Honey. So we do see sugar is one of the biggest cash crops of the Spanish New World colonies. This is going to be true with other colonies in the Caribbean, with the French and Dutch and English. This will be true in Brazil with the Portuguese, as we will see. So sugar is the biggest product that the Spanish will produce in their colonies, and they are going to use slave labor. They're going to use the encomienda. They are going to use those means of labor, not the mita system, though. That's only for mines in Peru. So we do see sugar is going to be a very desired commodity among Europeans. It's going to be a major reason why we will see the use of coerced labor, of slavery. That's something to remember for the unit test and for the AP exam. Sugar is going to lead to the further importation of African slaves. But agriculture, again, is the biggest focus of the Spanish colonies. And we do see that especially in the Caribbean. We see that in Mexico to a degree. The Caribbean is the biggest area for sugar production. It's the greatest in terms of the environment for sugar. And we do see that there is a ready and willing market for sugar in the New World. Most Native Americans are involved in agriculture, either with sugar, but we also do see, especially in New Spain, in places like modern day Mexico and modern day like Sonora and Arizona, that we do see cattle as well. That's going to be a other kind of product that's grown. There's tobacco as well. That's mostly in the Caribbean. Again, we also see corn, a way to feed the colonies in the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is literally just focused on sugar. In terms of kind of the economic system, again, we kind of have this plantation system that is emerging. We call these rural estates that grow things like sugar and cattle. These are haciendas, and they're going to be dominated mostly by native-born Spanish colonists, by the peninsulares, and we'll talk about them more later, actually. Mining is probably the most profitable of the industries in the New World, but it's the most brutal. And we do see that was one of the biggest motivations for the European settlement of the New World, was mining for gold and silver. And indeed, while there's not a lot of gold and silver in the Caribbean, there is plenty in mainland North and South America. There is some gold in the Caribbean, but mostly the Spanish are going to come across silver. Indeed, silver is one of the biggest products that the Spanish will come to produce in their colonies. We see a lot of silver mines pop up in Mexico, in Peru. That is why we see the development of the encomienda system. It is to maximize silver production and gold production in Chile. In Peru, they use the mita system for silver production. And the silver is desired because it is something that East Asian societies want. Remember, one of the big problems Europeans came across is that really East Asian societies, like the Ottoman Empire, like the Safavids, like the Mughals, like the Chinese, like the Japanese, as we'll talk about later, these societies don't really want manufactured goods from Europe because they could make them themselves, for goodness sake, at this point. But what they do want is silver. So we do see the massive mining of silver to satisfy East Asian demands so that Europeans can get stuff from China, for example. One of the biggest mines, and there was an AP question about this, that's why I'm mentioning it, is a huge mine in modern day Bolivia, but at that point it was in Peru, in modern day Bolivia, known as Potosi. And in your textbook, that also describes this huge mine, but it's a massive silver mine in modern day Bolivia, what was then the colony of Peru. It is a huge silver mine that is going to produce a huge amount of silver needed for the Spanish economy. So the Spanish economy is very much going to be dependent on silver production, probably a little too much so, because so much silver mined is going to drive its worth down. Sadly, or well, not really for Spain because they enslaved people, but whatever. We also, well, not whatever to slavery, but anyway. So we are going to see that this silver and gold is going to be produced into what we call bullion. Bullion essentially is processed gold and silver into bars, and this is what's going to be delivered to the New World. This bullion is going to be the basis of European banks, but also trade with, you guessed it, East Asia. But something that is important to note, the New World, North and South America, Spanish, Portuguese, Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, all of these colonies that practice mercantilism, all of these colonial societies that practice mercantilism, they have very little manufacturing. And that's going to be something we will deal with in the future. There's very little manufacturing in North and South America as a result of mercantilism. And this is just a Simpsons sugar, All right, anyway. So what systems of labor existed in the New World and how did they change over time? That's something you should be able to define and explain. So we've talked about kind of economic organization, but let's take a look at how do we centralize social institutions, and that is going to be through the development of racial categories. And I mentioned in chapter 2 that the concept of race is a relatively new one, and that is true. And we are going to see that that is best expressed in how these colonial societies will organize their multiracial societies. And indeed, yes, these colonies are going to be perhaps the most racially and ethnically diverse places in the early modern period. We see a massive combination of not just white settlers, but also of African slaves. We see Native Americans. We will see kind of in sporadic amounts, but Chinese immigrants as well. We do see a very racialized system. There are so many different races. However, these different races, at least the Native American and African ones, they are going to be kind of subject to the dominant ruling class, Europeans, white people. And we are going to actually see that there will be a bit more complications to this, because not just in addition to Europeans and natives and Africans, but there's also going to be a sizable amount in Spanish and Portuguese and French colonies, only these three. We are going to see a sizable amount of mixed race people as well. And that's for kind of a technical reason. We do see that very few European women will make their way into the New World, at least initially. And we do see that oftentimes the initial Spanish invaders, they will have relations. They will have relations with either Native Americans or African slaves. So we do see the rise of mixed race group, and that kind of complicates things. How do they fit in this African, European, and Native hierarchy? Oftentimes, it should be noted, and this is a very serious thing, that these mixed race marriages, especially from the initial conquerors, but also from enslavers of Africans, oftentimes this does happen through sexual exploitation. That's meaning sexual assault or rape, essentially. So we do see that kind of there is this very racially diverse society. And that is going to kind of compel colonial societies to come up with systems of racial hierarchy. Before we look at kind of the system that will emerge, it is important to note that even though Native American empires have been completely, or mostly completely destroyed in Spain, in Spanish colonies, we do see that native elites do have some influence. There is something unique about Spanish and Portuguese colonies in that they will have a larger indigenous population compared to, say, English colonies. French colonies also have a large indigenous population, as we'll see in Canada. And kind of the system that will emerge, that will reflect European dominance over both Native Americans and Africans, is going to be something known as the castas system, or in Spanish, the sociedad de castas. As you can tell, I took German in college. But anyway, this is going to be a system of racial hierarchy. And we'll show a picture in just a second and define some terms, but it is going to be a system of hierarchy that is going to impact social relations. And this is kind of answering that second lesson objective of how do new social groups maintain power over time. So we do see that white people, Europeans, European settlers, they're going to enforce their dominance by creating a racial hierarchy. However, something that is notable about Spanish, Portuguese, and French colonies is that there is a degree of social mobility, especially because race and freedom, these things are going to kind of be a lot more fluid in these mixed race societies. We will see that merely by the overwhelming amount of mixed race people, that it's bound to kind of have some way in which people can advance further up. If your mother was a white person, then that's a great thing. That means that that means you're kind of at the top of society. So there is a degree of social mobility if you have kind of if you are the child of a mixed race marriage, especially with a white person. And this is what the castas system looks like in general. On top, you have the peninsulares, and it's appropriately a period because they're the smallest amount of people in the New World. Peninsulares, they are Europeans, white people born on the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain, or in the case of Portuguese colonies, Portugal. Below them are white people who were born in the Americas. These are the Creoles. And the Creoles, they are white, but they aren't necessarily in political control. And a lot of the independence movements we'll talk about in Unit 5, they're going to be led by white Creoles who think peninsulares have too much power. We also have various different mixed race people. There's the mestizos. I don't like using these terms because they're so outdated, but mestizos, these are people of white and native descent. There's the mulattoes. These are people of white and African descent. Below these mixed race people are Native Americans. Below them are Native American and African kind of mixed race people. They're called the Zambas. And then below them are free Africans, and then below them are enslaved Africans. So it is a racial hierarchy. But as we'll talk about later, Spanish and French and Portuguese colonies kind of have a degree of social mobility, even towards African slaves, that English colonies do not, especially the ones that will become the United States. All right. So in terms of kind of political developments, we will see some changes, especially as Spain begins to decline as a colonial society. Spain is really going to fall from dominance in the international community after 1600. So Spain is going to fall behind for a variety of reasons. For one thing, there's piracy going on that's actually encouraged by English and French and Portuguese people looking to knock down the Spanish a little bit. Anyone play Sid Meier's Pirates before? Greatest game ever. I love that game. Mwah. Anyway, so we are going to see Spain is facing that problem. Piracy, that's going to disrupt overseas trade. We're also going to see a decline in the silver trade. That's going to cause economic problems for Spain. Basically, Spain produces too much silver. It destroys their economy. But we also see that Spain is going to engage in competition with European societies. That is going to kind of see the rise of other European groups, especially the English, but it will see the decline of Spain. And we do see that kind of other groups will replace the Spain. So kind of if you're thinking about who is the dominant European power in terms of overseas trade, first it's the Portuguese, then it's the Spanish, then it's the Dutch, then it's the English. The English are going to be the top dog in the world, as we will see, even going into the age of imperialism, as we'll talk about more in Unit 6. All right, anyway, so the rise of the Dutch and the English, these are going to kind of be the people who replace the Spanish in terms of dominance. But we are going to see that kind of Spain will fall from grace even further as a result of the War of Spanish Succession. And the war itself is important. We don't really talk about it all that much, but it is going to have a major result in its peace treaty. It is going to, result in other European powers taking away a lot of economic control Spain had over its economy. We are going to see that France and England, they're the ones going to be they're going to be the powers that will direct the international slave trade, for example. So that's going to take Spain out of the kind of great power running, you could say. They are going to lose this economic control over the slave trade in favor of powers like the Dutch and the French and the English. So the Treaty of Utrecht, which is going to end the Spanish War of Succession, is mostly going to favor countries like, not Spain, it's going to favor countries like the Netherlands, England, and France. And we do see that these three countries are going to take away a lot of economic power Spain has over its colonies, especially in taking away key Spanish holdings like Jamaica. That's going to go towards the English, for example. We are going to see as well the slave trade that Spain operated. That's going to fall under the purview, the control of other European powers. So we do see that Spain is kind of losing its economic hold over its colonies. And in order to solidify that, we are going to see a series of reforms that attempt to reverse that trend of economic decline. And these are known as the Barbarian Reforms, named after the new Bourbon dynasty in Spain. The War of Spanish Succession was about that's a little funny, but the Habsburgs were like too inbred. They couldn't make children anymore. Charles II, look up a picture of him. Absolutely. He's called the cursed one in Spanish, if that's any indication. But he can't make children, so there's a big old war. And eventually, like, France becomes the French monarchy eventually kind of their family controls Spain now. But anyway, that's beyond the scope of our class. So we do see that kind of in order to reverse the trend of economic decline, Spain is going to engage in a series of reforms known as the Bourbon Reforms. And we do see these reforms will have a few things. For one thing, they're going to reorganize the Spanish colonies to be more directly influenced and controlled by the Spanish monarchy. We do see the creation of new viceroyalties, places like New Granada, for example, places like what will become Argentina, the Viceroyalty of Buenos Aires. And we are going to see that kind of, even though Creoles and indigenous elite did enjoy some privileges under the era before the Bourbon reforms, that these Creoles, these native-born white people, and also native elites from the indigenous community, they're going to be removed from colonial government. That's going to piss them off, I'm not going to lie. We are going to see that in order to solidify control over religion, the Jesuits are going to be expelled from the colonies. So that's a huge change by the 1700s, the expulsion of the Jesuits, I believe by 1776, actually. But we're also going to see, in order to maximize economic profitability, the Spanish are going to increase taxes. They're going to further regulate trade, and they're also going to import more slaves. They want basically to produce as much as possible, and they're going to bring in as much unpaid labor as possible. But the big impact of the Bourbon reforms, and the reason why I'm mentioning it, is that these greater restrictions on the economic conditions of the Spanish colonies, that's going to piss off a lot of colonists, a lot of elite whites, these Creoles especially. So we are going to see that the Bourbon reforms, as we'll talk about more in Unit 5, are sowing the seeds for future independence movements, mostly because these white people, these Creoles, they don't want to see their property taxed. They want to ensure their status in society in the New World. So we do see Creoles are mostly going to be the biggest people upset by this, but there are also racial tensions as well. We do see, of course, more African slaves. That's going to not be a very, great thing in terms of race relations. Slaves generally don't like being slaves, as we'll talk about more later. But we also do see that indigenous elites, or Amerindians, so Native American elites, they are going to stage rebellions actually in response to the taking away of indigenous elite positions in colonial government. We do see, for example, a series of rebellions by a Inca nobleman by the name of Tupac Amaru. This is actually where the rapper Tupac gets his name from. But anyway, he is going to stage a rebellion, and this is kind of showing that Native people, both white and indigenous and African, they really don't like these reforms made by the Spanish monarchy. So you should be able to answer this question right here. How did ideas of race develop in the New World? Excuse me. All right, so we're going to wrap up today by talking about the Portuguese and what they're doing down in Brazil, because even though the Portuguese are mostly all about port cities, because they're the Portuguese, we are going to see that their exceptions are inland territory in Brazil, but also in Angola. We're going to mostly focus on Brazil, of course. So Brazil is going to be the major Portuguese colony in the New World. They got this land thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas. And we are going to see that Portuguese Brazil is going to embody a lot of the same trends of Spanish America. So those ideas of the castas system, the initial trying out of the encomienda, the use of African slaves, all of these things are going to be big in Brazil as well. The only difference is that they're controlled by different monarchies and speak different languages. So we are going to see Portuguese settlement by the 1530s, actually. So Portugal is going to kind of be the second major power to set up colonies in the New World, and they're going to do that mostly in Brazil. It's the only place they really can do it. And the Portuguese economy in Brazil is mostly going to be defined by the use of slave labor. Portugal is going to heavily import slaves into Brazil. Portugal is the dominant slave trading power until the Spanish take it over by the 1600s. And we do see that Portugal will heavily import slaves, mostly because of the very dangerous labor conditions on its plantations and in the mines, as we'll talk about. And Brazil is going to have an extremely high African population. We do see that by 1775, actually, 50%, half of people living in Brazil are slaves. That is a huge amount. African Americans, or well, I suppose they're African Americans at this point, but people of African descent are going to largely outnumber white people in Brazil. And that's actually fairly true today, actually. So we do see that there will be a heavy use of slave labor. And the big industries in Brazil, as we'll see, are gold mining and sugar production. And Brazil, actually, just to put an interesting think about it, but Brazil is actually going to be one of the last places in the world to get rid of African chattel slavery. So the chattel slavery means the selling of property of human beings. And we'll talk about that term later on, don't worry. But we will see Brazil kind of will have a long-lasting impact in terms of slave labor in its society. Mostly the Brazilian economy is going to be producing a Brazilian pounds of sugar. I have to be somewhat joking about terrible subjects like this. Anyway, so we are going to see the production of sugar, especially in coastal areas. Brazil will account for the highest sugar production in the world, actually. But as we will talk about more when we discuss the nature of slavery, we will see that these are very brutal conditions. One of the big reasons why more Africans are, quote unquote, needed in the New World is because of sugar production. But the conditions on sugar plantations are terrible, as we will see later. There's disease, there's extreme temperatures, there's amputations that happen because of these dangerous equipment that the slaves have to use. So we do see that Brazil will be a heavy importing society of slaves. Rio de Janeiro, which will eventually become the capital of Brazil, and then it's eventually moved in the 20th century to someplace else. But Rio de Janeiro is one of the biggest slave ports in the New World, actually. About 7,000 people a year until 1860, actually, are going to be imported from Africa. That's a huge amount of people, most of them going to Rio de Janeiro. The other area where we see slaves being used is in gold production. That's going to actually be kind of reason why there will be inland settlement by the Portuguese, and they're going to look for gold. One of the biggest areas that produces gold is an area known as Minas Gerais. I'm not Portuguese, obviously. I can't speak anything, but we do see gold production. We see wood production. All of these things going to be beneficial in the Portuguese trading economy. But we do see that Portugal is going to face very similar problems by the 1750s, especially thanks to competition with the Dutch and the English. The Dutch are going to set up their own sugar-producing colonies, literally right next door to Brazil in a place called Guyana. And we are going to see that Brazil is no longer the top sugar producer. And we also see that kind of the Netherlands now controls the slave trade, and that's not going to kind of benefit Portugal and its demand for slaves. So we do see, very similar to the Bourbon reforms, the Colonial reforms that's led by the Secretary of State, the kind of foreign minister equivalent, by the name of the Marquis de Pombal. The Marquis de Pombal is a very weird man, a very interesting individual. He's an authoritarian by all accounts, but he is going to issue a lot of reforms known as the Pombaline reforms. And these reforms are, again, very similar to the Bourbon in that they are going to be designed to strengthen the Portuguese Empire. So again, consolidation of political colonial administration. So we are going to see kind of a strengthening of mercantilism. We're going to see the elimination of tax evasion. People who are convicted of tax evasion are going to be imprisoned for not giving their money to the state. We also see that kind of limits on gold will be made. Gold is going to only go to Portugal. Beforehand, it was kind of also going to Great Britain, which is basically not stealing the gold, but it is getting the gold from Portugal. We also see that the Portuguese, they're going to diversify Brazil's economy. They're going to introduce coffee as well. So what better thing to go with sugar than coffee? And coffee is a big exporting thing in Brazil, even to this day. But we also, much like the Spanish, are going to see an increase in the use of slavery. More slave workers means faster production, according to the Portuguese at the time. That means we get to have more money. So we do see that very similar to the Bourbon reforms. We will have a strengthening of government control over the economy that also actually leads to the increased use of slaves. And they are somewhat successful, the Pomeline reforms. We do see a little bit of animosity by the Creole class, but as we'll talk about Brazil and its independence movement later, but they're very kind of they're interesting. They have a monarchy at one point. We'll talk about that later. But they are successful in the sense that there will be more slavery. So I guess that's the goal of all this thing, and that's what they wanted. So I guess they got that going. They are going to stop gold exports to the UK, but Portugal is declining as an imperial power. They are not going to be able to compete with the great powers of Europe like France and England. So, how did Spain and Portugal try to reform their colonies? All right. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, let me know. Drop a like, leave a comment, everything. Bye bye. Have a great day. Doop bop boop bop sugar. Do 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 do.